For hundreds of years, people have been told that the pyramids were tombs, places to bury dead kings and rulers from long ago. But what if that story isn't true? What if these huge buildings are not the start of civilization, but the last remaining proof that humans have died out and come back before? Across the Egyptian desert, under the hot sun, stands a shape so perfect it shouldn't be possible. 3 pyramids lined up to point exactly north, south, east, and west. Each pyramid is made of 2 million stone blocks that weigh tons, fitted together so tightly that you can't slide a knife blade between them. And beneath it all sits the Sphinx, worn down by time, mysterious, and maybe older than the sand that covers it. New studies of rocks and earth suggest that water once carved the Sphinx's body, hundreds of years of rainfall that stopped long before Egypt's kings existed. Studies of the stars showed that the pyramids match a group of stars called Orion's belt, exactly as it looked not 4,500 years ago, but 12,000 years ago. And that number is important because 12,000 years ago, the world almost ended. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas catastrophe. Pieces of a broken comet hit Earth and turned green lands into frozen wastelands. The oceans rose and drowned coastlines. Civilizations fell apart. Many types of animals disappeared. Forests became deserts, and the survivors barely made it. Yet the pyramids still stand silent, perfect, and impossibly old. So we must ask the question that no textbook dares to ask: were the people who built the pyramids at Giza survivors of that lost world? A civilization erased by fire from space in a worldwide flood, leaving only stone witnesses behind. Tonight, we return to the place that challenges time itself, to understand the sound vibrations, the stars, and the silence they left carved in limestone and ancient stories. If this story challenged everything you thought you knew about human history, share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe for more forgotten mysteries the textbooks won't tell you, and leave a comment. What ancient place do you think holds secrets we haven't discovered yet? Ancient rivers hidden under the sand. Satellite pictures from NASA's space shuttle show huge buried river systems snaking beneath the Sahara Desert sand dunes, old river channels that once turned North Africa into a maze of water. One of them, the Tamanrasset River, crossed the middle of the continent, forming a river delta the size of modern Egypt. Another recently discovered river branch, called the Aramat Branch, flowed near the Giza area itself. The name means pyramids in Arabic, fitting because it may have flowed right at the limestone foundations of the monuments we see today. 12,000 years ago, this area was not desert but grassland, a green path stretching from the Red Sea to the Atlantic Ocean, filled with gazelles, elephants, and human communities that lived along riverbanks now buried under 100 feet of sand. Pollen samples taken from old lake bottoms and fossilized remains of hippos, crocodiles, and freshwater fish in the western desert prove the Sahara once was full of life. Scientists who study rocks call this time the African humid period, when the wind patterns that bring rain shifted north, and rainfall turned empty sand dunes into an oasis of lakes, forests, and flowing rivers. Cave art from Gulf Kebir and Tassili Najar shows this lost paradise: giraffes eating beneath acacia trees, hunters tracking antelope, reed boats floating across waters that no longer exist. These aren't myths. They're records painted by people who saw the Sahara when it was still alive. Then disaster struck. Around 12,900 years ago, at the start of the Younger Dryas, the rains stopped. Temperatures dropped suddenly. Ice sheets that had been melting pushed south again, and the rainy season failed. Within a few generations, lakes dried up into salt flats. Rivers turned to dust, and the green Sahara died. The people who lived there had two choices: die with the land or move east, following the last source of water, the Nile River. If huge buildings existed before this disaster, most would have disappeared, buried under moving sand, worn away by wind, swallowed by shifting dunes. Only structures carved into solid rock or built on high, stable ground could survive. The Sphinx and the Great Pyramid, with their foundations attached to limestone bedrock, might be survivors of that earlier time monuments, carried through thousands of years by the same drying that erased everything else around them. Core drilling beneath the Giza area reveals layers of different types of earth, river deposits, clay, packed soil, silent records of a climate that kept changing. Within these layers, scientists found freshwater diatoms, tiny algae that grow only in standing water. They prove that this land, now one of the driest on Earth, once held ponds, streams, and seasonal floods. Even the limestone around the Sphinx shows deep up and down erosion channels, grooves carved not by wind, which wears away rock side to side, but by hundreds of years of falling rain. Some scientists who study rocks propose that this wetter time between 12,000 and 8,000 BC could have been the true age when the earliest buildings at Giza were made. A short period of recovery, when the ice pulled back, rivers briefly returned, and the weather became stable. The horizon would have been clear then, the Nile overflowing with life, the stars sharp against an unpolluted sky, conditions perfect not just for survival, but for huge engineering projects in exact alignment with the stars. Ancient carvings echo this forgotten climate. Carvings at Wadi Hammamat speak of flowing streams where only rock exists today. Others near Karga oasis show gazelles and long-extinct wild cattle grazing beside water. And far to the southwest at Nabta, a stone circle older than Stonehenge tracks the summer solstice sunrise with mathematical perfection. Its builders, cattle herders living by seasonal lakes, were already mapping the heavens. When their land turned to desert, they moved toward the Nile, carrying their knowledge of the stars with them. Perhaps they were the ancestors of those who would one day align Giza to the stars with impossible accuracy. Imagine that moment of change, rivers fading, forests withering into dust, people realizing their world was ending not in a single storm, but in the slow choking of drought. They may have built not from pride or selfishness, but from memory, monuments meant to outlast the collapse, to prove that they had existed, that they had understood the universe, and that they refused to be forgotten. The first stones may have been raised as an act of remembering, a record in limestone of a world about to drown in sand. Strangely, it was the desert that saved that record. The same dryness that kills life has kept the past intact, frozen in time. In archaeology, this is called the paradox of preservation, the truth that emptiness protects. Papyrus, mummies, paint, and granite have lasted for thousands of years because the rains never came back. Egypt's past did not vanish. It was preserved in sand. When you stand at Giza today beneath the morning sun, you are not seeing civilization's victory over nature, but the remains of nature's retreat. The pyramids are geological fossils of human will, memories of a greener earth, carved in a time when the Sahara still breathed, and the stars lined up differently in the sky. Science now confirms what ancient stories have always hinted at: Egypt was born not alone, but in a cycle: creation, destruction, renewal. Its roots reach back into the rhythms of the planet itself, to times when the climate was alive, and humanity danced on the edge of extinction. The desert is not emptiness. It is a storage place. Every sand dune holds data, chemical markers, pollen grains, fossilized dust, whispers of worlds that came before. And so the story begins not with what was built, but with what was lost. Before we can ask who raised the pyramids, we must first ask, what kind of world could give birth to them? And what kind of disaster could erase it so completely that only 3 limestone mountains and a lion-bodied riddle remain? The Sphinx's secret, evidence of ancient rainfall. The sun climbs higher now, and with it, the light sharpens against the face of the Great Sphinx. Every tourist sees the same figure: the human head, the lion's body, the huge stillness gazing east toward the rising sun. But look closer at what surrounds it: the trench in which the Sphinx lies half buried, carved straight down into the bedrock like a quarry frozen in time. These walls are the Sphinx's oldest secret. Run your hand, if you could, along the inner walls. The rock is wavy, shaped like flowing water frozen in place. The channels run up and down, not side to side as wind erosion would create, as if heavy rains once poured down the walls for hundreds of years, carving the stone with endless patience. These are not wind-sculpted lines. They are the footprints of rainfall, heavy, long-lasting, and impossible under Egypt's current climate, which gets less than an inch of rain per year. When Dr. Robert Schoch, a scientist who studies rocks from Boston University, first examined these features in 1991, he approached them not as someone enchanted by pharaohs, but as a scientist of stone. He noticed that the most deeply weathered layers occur in the oldest rock layers, which lie under both the Sphinx and the Giza area. This limestone is relatively soft, easily shaped by water, but very resistant to wind wearing it away. Schoch compared the erosion patterns to similar rain-carved formations elsewhere in the Nile Valley and across the eastern Sahara, and the results were startling. The vertical cracks, the wave-like curves, the depth of weathering all pointed to one conclusion: the Sphinx had been exposed to hundreds of years of heavy rainfall. Not occasional storms, but steady precipitation on a scale Egypt hasn't experienced in recorded history. To find a climate that could produce such erosion, Schoch had to look back beyond the pharaohs, beyond the earliest kingdoms, beyond even the first farming settlements along the Nile. He had to go back to when the Sahara was green. Between approximately 14,800 and 5,500 BC, North Africa went through a change so complete it would be unrecognizable today. This time period, known to climate scientists as the African Humid Period, represents one of the most dramatic climate shifts in human history, a time when the world's largest desert bloomed into a continent-wide oasis. The cause was related to Earth's orbit. Earth's tilt and wobble caused the West African monsoon to shift northward, carrying moisture-laden winds deep into what is now empty wasteland. Summer rains fell not in scattered showers, but in seasonal floods, filling river valleys, carving lake basins, and turning sand into soil. The evidence is written in layers. Core samples drilled from ancient lake beds across the Sahara reveal pollen grains preserved in earth, acacia, wild grasses, fig trees, tamarisk species that require steady rainfall and fertile ground. In the Chad Basin, scientists found fossilized remains of Nile perch, a freshwater fish that today exists only in the Great Lakes of East Africa. In Libya's Fezzan region, digging uncovered the bones of crocodiles, hippos, and elephants, creatures that cannot survive without permanent water sources. Radiocarbon dating places these remains between 12,000 and 6,000 years old, a span of time when the Sahara was not a desert, but a savanna, a mix of grasslands, wetlands, and scattered forests, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Red Sea. This was not a marginal landscape. It was thriving. Diadem samples microscopic fossilized algae found in sediment cores confirm the presence of freshwater lakes and slow-moving rivers throughout regions that today receive less than an inch of rain per year. Some of these lakes were vast. Lake Megachat at its peak around 9000 BC, covered an area larger than the Caspian Sea, its shores dotted with fishing communities whose tools and pottery still lie buried beneath the sand. The people who lived there left their mark in stone. At Tassili Najar in southern Algeria, rock shelters carved into sandstone cliffs hold some of the world's most haunting prehistoric art, over 15,000 paintings and engravings, spanning thousands of years. The earliest show a world of plenty: giraffes towering over acacia trees, herds of antelope crossing open plains, humans swimming in rivers that no longer exist. There were images of reed boats with their curved fronts cutting through water, fishermen with nets and harpoons, women gathering at the water's edge. Further east, in Egypt's Gulf Kebir Plateau, cave paintings show similar scenes, human figures dancing, hunting, herding cattle beside lakes that today are nothing but dust and stone. These are not abstract symbols. They are records painted by people who knew water, who depended on it, who built their entire existence around the rhythms of rain and river. And then, with shocking speed, it ended. Around 12,900 years ago, Earth's climate entered a period of catastrophic instability known as the Younger Dryas. The name comes from an Arctic wildflower that suddenly reappeared in European pollen records, a cold-living species that had vanished during the warming period, only to return as temperatures dropped. The cause remains debated, but evidence increasingly points to something from space: a broken comet or asteroid that hit the northern ice sheets, triggering a cascade of atmospheric and ocean disruptions. The North Atlantic circulation slowed. The jet stream shifted, and the West African monsoon, which had been feeding the Sahara's rivers for thousands of years, collapsed. The rain stopped almost overnight. Lake levels dropped. Rivers shrank to seasonal streams, then to dried channels. The grasslands withered. Within a few generations, perhaps within a single human lifetime, the green corridor of North Africa began its transformation back into desert. The change was not gradual. It was violent. Sediment cores from Lake Basumtwi in Ghana show a sudden shift in dust deposits around 12,800 years ago. Massive amounts of airborne sand suddenly appearing in layers that had previously shown organic-rich soil. This is the signature of desertification at speed of plant cover, collapsing so quickly that wind could carry entire landscapes into the sky. For the communities living across the Sahara, this was apocalypse. Imagine watching your world die, not in fire or flood, but in the slow choking of drought. The lake you fished from for generations shrinking year by year until only cracked mud remains. The herds of gazelle and antelope migrating away, following the retreating rains. The trees dying back, their roots unable to reach water that no longer exists. And finally, the understanding that you must leave or die. The human response was migration and mass exodus toward the last remaining sources of water. And in North Africa, that meant the Nile. Fed by water sources near the equator in Ethiopia and Uganda, the Nile continued to flow, even as the surrounding lands turned to dust. It became a refuge, a lifeline, the only green thread in a continent of sand. Archaeological evidence shows a dramatic increase in settlement along the Nile Valley, beginning around 11,000 BC exactly, when the Sahara's collapse would have forced populations eastward. These were not primitive refugees. They were the survivors of a sophisticated culture, people who had tracked the stars, who had painted cosmic symbols in their caves, who had understood animal herding and seasonal navigation. They brought their knowledge with them, their understanding of celestial cycles, their traditions of monument building, their memory of the world that had drowned in sand. And perhaps, just perhaps, they brought something else. The earliest massive stone constructions in Egypt appear not in the Nile Delta, but on the western desert edge in places like Nabta Playa, where a megalithic stone circle dated to 7000 BC tracks the summer solstice with precision that rivals Stonehenge. Its builders were cattle herders living beside a seasonal lake, using astronomy to predict the rains. When that lake finally dried up around 5500 BC, its people too would have moved toward the Nile. Some archaeologists now theorize that the astronomical knowledge embedded in Giza's layout, the precision, the celestial alignments, the geometric sophistication may not have originated with the pharaohs at all, but with these earlier cultures, survivors of the Green Sahara, who carried their cosmic understanding into the Nile Valley and encoded it in monuments designed to outlast memory itself. Because if you are the last generation of a dying world, what do you leave behind? If your lakes are evaporating, your forests turning to dust, and your entire civilization facing extinction, how do you ensure that anything survives to prove that you existed, that you understood the cosmos, that you were here? You build in stone. You build in bedrock. You build structures so massive, so perfectly aligned, so geometrically precise that even if language dies, even if writing is forgotten, even if every other trace of your culture is swallowed by sand, the architecture itself will speak. The Sphinx, carved from a limestone outcrop, its body shaped directly from the living rock of the plateau, could endure floods and droughts alike. The Great Pyramid, its core blocks weighing up to 70 tons, fitted so tightly that earthquakes cannot shift them, designed not for a single royal family, but for eternity. These are not tombs. They are testaments. And if they date not to 2500 BC, but to the closing window of the African humid period, to that desperate era between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, when the rains were failing, and the world was ending, then everything we've been told about the origins of civilization is wrong. The pyramids are not the beginning. They are the last survivors of a world that came before, monuments raised by those who knew they were living in the final age of water, who built not for kings but for memory, not for the dead, but for a future they would never see. Carved into bedrock when the Sahara still breathed, silent witnesses to the flood and the drought that followed. The Sphinx, a monument older than the pharaohs. If the pyramids are witnesses to a forgotten age, then the Sphinx is its last living voice. It sits at the eastern edge of the Giza area, carved from a single piece of limestone bedrock, its body pointing perfectly toward the sunrise on the equinox. For over 4,000 years of recorded history, it has been called guardian, mystery, and riddle. But the greatest riddle is not what it represents. It is when it was born. The accepted story is simple. The Sphinx was carved around 2500 BC, during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, 4th king of Egypt's 4th dynasty. The evidence of style comparison between the Sphinx's face and statues of Khafre found nearby, and the assumption that monumental sculpture in Egypt began with the pharaohs, so anything this grand must belong to their age. But geology tells a different story. When Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist and professor at Boston University, was invited to examine the Sphinx in 1990, he came with no agenda, only the tools of his discipline. He was not someone seeking to confirm royal dates. He was a scientist of stone, trained to read erosion patterns the way linguists read ancient scripts. And what he read in the limestone walls surrounding the Sphinx should not have been there. The Sphinx does not stand on the plateau's surface. It sits within a deep rectangular trench carved down into the bedrock like a quarry, a depression roughly 30 feet deep and several hundred feet long. The walls of this enclosure are the key. They are the Sphinx's original surface, the rock that was exposed when the monument was first carved, and a bare type of weathering that does not match Egypt's climate for the past 5,000 years. Schoch documented deep vertical cracks, channels running top to bottom along the enclosure walls, some over a foot deep, carved with a wave-like undulating texture. These are not the horizontal lines you see from wind erosion, which carves rock in parallel layers as sandlet in air scours the surface. These are precipitation-induced weathering patterns, formed when water flows consistently down rock faces over hundreds of years, dissolving softer layers and cutting vertical grooves through chemical and mechanical action. To understand the importance, you must understand the rock itself. The Sphinx and its enclosure are carved from the Macadam Formation, a sedimentary limestone laid down 50 million years ago, when this region was an ancient seabed. The stone is layered with sections of varying hardness, some dense and resistant, others porous and soft. When exposed to heavy, sustained rainfall, water penetrates the softer layers, widening cracks, dissolving calcium carbonate, and creating the wavy, flowing patterns visible today. Schoch compared these erosion features to other limestone formations across Egypt. He examined tombs carved during the Old Kingdom, structures definitely dated to 2500 BC and later. Their surfaces showed wind erosion, horizontal scoring, surface pitting, gradual mechanical wearing from airborne sand. They showed no deep vertical channeling, no wave-like curves, no evidence of prolonged water weathering. But the Sphinx enclosure did. He then examined natural rock formations in the eastern desert and along the Nile Valley that had been exposed to rainfall during the African humid period, places where geological processes, not human construction, provided a control comparison. The patterns matched the depth of weathering, the verticality of the channels, the texture of the erosion, all consistent with hundreds of years of precipitation in a climate far wetter than anything Egypt has experienced in historical times. The implication was unavoidable. The Sphinx had been carved and exposed to the elements during an era when Egypt received regular heavy rainfall, a climate that ended thousands of years before the pharaohs. Schoch's analysis, published in peer-reviewed journals and presented at the Geological Society of America, concluded that the weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure were consistent with exposure beginning at least 7000 to 9000 BC, possibly earlier. That would place the Sphinx's origin not in the age of pyramids, but in the final centuries of the African humid period, when the Sahara was still green and rain still fell. The response from Egyptology was immediate and hostile. Scholars pointed to the stylistic evidence. The Sphinx's face, they argued, resembles surviving statues of Pharaoh Khafre. Therefore, it must have been carved during his reign. They cited the proximity of Khafre's pyramid, the alignment of the causeway, the lack of any mention of the Sphinx in earlier texts. They argued that accepting Schoch's dating would require rewriting the entire timeline of Egyptian civilization, a prospect the field was unwilling to consider. But the counter-arguments carried their own contradictions. First, the facial resemblance is debatable. The Sphinx's head is oddly small compared to its body, a feature noted by engineers and sculptors for centuries. Some researchers have suggested the head was recarved in ancient times, that an earlier, larger lion head was cut down and reshaped into human form during the 4th dynasty, which would explain both the stylistic similarity to Kafir and the strangely small proportions. Second, the argument from silence that no earlier texts mention the Sphinx proves nothing. The vast majority of Egypt's written records have been lost. We have no complete archives from before 3000 BC. The absence of textual evidence is not evidence of absence. And third, there exists a curious artifact that Egyptologists rarely discuss in public: the inventory stela, discovered at Giza in the 19th century. It is a limestone tablet inscribed with Middle Kingdom hieroglyphs. It describes Pharaoh Khufu, Kafir's predecessor, builder of the Great Pyramid, not as the creator of the Sphinx, but as its restorer. The text states that Khufu found the house of Isis, mistress of the pyramid, beside the house of the Sphinx, implying the Sphinx already existed, already had a temple, and was already ancient when Khufu commissioned work on the plateau. Mainstream Egyptologists dismiss the stela as a later fabrication, a piece of pharaonic propaganda, designed to claim legitimacy by associating a king with older monuments. But even if the stela dates to a later period, the claim it makes is revealing. Even in ancient times, the Egyptians themselves regarded the Sphinx as older than the pyramids, a relic from an earlier age that required restoration, not construction. This pattern appears elsewhere. The dream stela erected between the Sphinx's paws by Pharaoh Thutmose IV around 1400 BC describes the monument as already buried by sand, its body weathered and damaged. Thutmose did not claim to have built it. He claimed to have cleared it, to have rescued it from being forgotten. Even 1,300 years after Kafir's reign, the Sphinx was treated not as a recent royal monument, but as an inheritance from the distant past. Geological evidence, textual hints, and architectural oddities all point in the same direction. The Sphinx is older than we have been told, far older. If Schacht's analysis is correct, then the creature we see today is not what it once was. The lion body, massive and intact, may be largely original, carved when the rain still fell and the plateau was green. But the head, eroded beyond recognition, could have been recarved during the 4th dynasty, reshaped into human form to honor Kafir or another king, its features cut down from an earlier, larger design now lost to time. This would explain the wrong proportions. It would explain the stylistic resemblance, and it would reconcile geology with archaeology. The body ancient, the face renewed, a palimpsest in stone. Stand before the Sphinx at dawn, and you see what the pharaohs saw: a figure half buried, weathered, mysterious. Its gaze is fixed on the horizon, where the sun rises twice a year in perfect alignment with its axis. It has watched the Nile flood and recede 10,000 times. It has outlasted empires, languages, and religions. It has survived not one climate, but two: the Green Sahara and the desert that consumed it. The deep channels carved into the enclosure walls are not flaws. They are memory waters' signature written in stone, proof that this monument witnessed rain that modern Egypt will never see again. The Sphinx is not a riddle of words. It is a riddle of time. And if it truly dates to the age before the pharaohs, then it stands as the last physical witness to a world erased by climate collapse, a monument raised when the rains were failing, when the green land was dying, and when those who built it knew their time was ending. Carved in stone not to honor a king, but to defy being forgotten, a sentinel from the age of water, staring eastward into eternity, waiting for someone, anyone, to remember. The star map Giza's alignment with Orion's belt. If the geology of Giza points backward in time, then perhaps we've been looking in the wrong direction. Perhaps the answer lies not in the ground beneath the monuments, but in the sky above them. For centuries, scholars have marveled at the precision of Giza's layout. The Great Pyramid's sides align to true north with an accuracy of 360ths of a single degree, a margin of error so small it rivals modern surveying. The three main pyramids stand in a diagonal line running from northeast to southwest, their placement neither random nor symmetrical, but arranged in a pattern that feels deliberate, almost coded. Yet no one could explain why they were positioned this way until an engineer looked up. In 1983, Robert Bauval, a Belgian construction engineer working in Saudi Arabia, was studying the pyramids from aerial photographs when something caught his attention. The alignment of the three pyramids, Khufu's Great Pyramid, Kafir's slightly smaller pyramid, and Menkare's much smaller third pyramid, was not a straight line. The third pyramid was offset slightly to the east, breaking the symmetry in a way that seemed intentional but unexplainable. Then one night in the Arabian desert, Bauval happened to look up at Orion's belt. The constellation hung low on the horizon, three brilliant stars arranged in a diagonal line: Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka. Two stars were perfectly aligned. The third, Mintaka, the dimmest of the three, was offset slightly to the east. The match was perfect. Not approximate perfect. The three pyramids of Giza, when viewed from above, mirror the three stars of Orion's belt with a precision that defies coincidence. The Great Pyramid corresponds to Alnitak, the brightest and southernmost star. Kafir's pyramid aligns with Alnilam, the middle star. And Menkare's smaller pyramid, offset to the east, matches Mintaka, the faintest star, also offset in the same direction. Even their relative sizes correspond to two larger Pyramids represent the two brighter stars, the smaller pyramid represents the dimmer one, and the entire arrangement is rotated to match the angle of Orion's belt as it appears in the southern sky. But Bauval didn't stop there. If the pyramids mirrored Orion, then perhaps the Nile flowing north beside the monuments represented the Milky Way, the celestial river that runs through the night sky with Orion positioned along its western bank. And if that were true, then Giza was not simply a royal cemetery. It was a terrestrial map of the heavens, a landscape designed to mirror the cosmos. The implications were staggering. But one question remained: when? Orion is not fixed in the sky. Like all constellations, its position changes over time, due to the precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble in Earth's axis, caused by gravitational forces from the Sun and Moon. This wobble takes approximately 26,000 years to complete one full cycle, meaning that the night sky visible to ancient Egyptians was not the same sky we see today. Stars rise and set at different positions. Constellations drift across the path of the Sun, and celestial alignments that seem perfect in one era become misaligned in another. So Bauval and his colleague Adrian Gilbert used astronomical software to model the sky above Giza throughout history. They wanted to know in which era did the pyramids layout most perfectly match Orion's belt. The answer was not 2500 BC, the traditional date of the pyramid's construction. The alignment was close in that era, good enough that one might assume it was intentional, but it was not exact. The angle was slightly off. The stars were not at their lowest point in their cycle, the position that would make the match most precise. To find the perfect match, Bauval had to go far back to around 10,500 BC. At that moment in time, 12,500 years ago, at the tail end of the Younger Dryas, in the final centuries before agriculture, before writing, before any civilization we recognize, the three stars of Orion's belt hung low on the southern horizon in the exact configuration mirrored by the pyramids. Their angle, their spacing, their relative brightness all corresponded exactly to the monuments on the plateau. It was as if Giza had been designed not to commemorate the sky of the 4th dynasty, but to freeze in stone the sky of a much older world. And there was more. During that same year, another alignment emerged, one even more striking than Orion. In 10,500 BC, at the moment of the spring equinox, an observer standing at the Sphinx would have watched the constellation Leo the Lion rise on the eastern horizon, in perfect alignment with the monument's gaze. The Sphinx, a lion's body with a human head, faces due east toward the equinox sunrise. And 12,500 years ago, it would have been staring directly at its celestial counterpart as it emerged from the horizon. This is not a trivial coincidence. Precession means that different constellations rise at the equinox in different years. Today, Pisces rises in that position. 2,000 years ago, it was Aries. In the age of the pharaohs around 2500 BC, it was Taurus. But in 10,500 BC, it was Leo, the only time in the entire 26,000-year cycle when a lion in the sky would greet a lion on the ground at the moment of cosmic balance. If the Sphinx and the pyramids were designed as a unified complex, if they were meant to encode a specific moment in time, then that moment was not the 4th dynasty. It was the age when the Green Sahara was dying, when the rains were ceasing, when the survivors of the collapsing world were building monuments to preserve what they knew. And what they knew was astronomy. The ancient Egyptians of the royal period were obsessed with the stars. They aligned their temples to solstices and equinoxes. They tracked the rising of Sirius to predict the Nile's flood. They divided the night sky into Deacon's 10-degree segments used to measure time and navigate the afterlife. Their mythology was drenched in celestial symbolism: Ra the sun, not the sky, Osiris as Orion, Isis as Sirius. But perhaps this knowledge was not original to them. Perhaps it was inherited. If a civilization existed before the pharaohs, one with sufficient astronomical understanding to track precession, to align monuments to cardinal directions with laser precision, to encode specific celestial configurations in stone, then the question becomes why? Why build a monument to a sky that no longer exists? Why go to such extraordinary lengths to preserve the memory of star positions from 8,000 years? Before your own time. Unless you are not building for your present. Unless you are building for the future. Imagine a culture facing extinction, its climate collapsing, its population scattering, its knowledge at risk of being lost forever. Writing may not exist yet. Oral tradition is fragile, vulnerable to the chaos of migration and survival. But stone endures. Geometry endures. And the stars, in their slow dance of precession, provide a universal clock that any future civilization, if it advances far enough, will eventually learn to read. By encoding the sky of 10,500 BC into the layout of Giza, the builders created a timestamp, a message that says, "We were here. We understood the cosmos, and this is when our world ended." It's a message that transcends language. Mathematics is universal. Astronomical alignments are objective, verifiable, independent of culture or interpretation. Any sufficiently advanced civilization that studies Giza will eventually discover the Orion correlation. They will model the precession, and they will arrive at the same conclusion: this complex was designed to remember a specific moment in deep time. The pyramids are not tombs. They are not power plants. They are archives, repositories of knowledge encoded in the only medium that could survive thousands of years of climate change, cultural upheaval, and the erosion of memory. And the knowledge they preserve is this: we have been here before. Civilization has risen, and it has fallen. The stars have witnessed our extinction and our rebirth. And if you are reading this message in stone, then you too are survivors, inheritors of a cycle that stretches back beyond the reach of history. Stand at Giza on the spring equinox just before dawn. Face east where the Sphinx faces. Watch as the sky begins to pale, stars fading one by one. In the Royal Age, the Egyptians would have seen Taurus rising. Today, we see Pisces. But 12,500 years ago, the first light would have illuminated Leo, the lion in the sky, mirroring the lion on the ground. And to the south, hanging low over the horizon, Orion's belt would have aligned perfectly with the three pyramids stretched across the plateau. Behind you, a terrestrial echo of a celestial arrangement, preserved in 2 million blocks of limestone, waiting for a future generation to look up and understand. The message is clear if you know how to read it. Giza is not a monument to the dead. It is a monument to memory itself, a record written in stone and stars, a dialogue between earth and cosmos, a bridge across the abyss of time connecting the world that was to the world that would come after. The sky has changed. The climate has changed. Languages and empires have risen and fallen. But the pyramids remain, still pointing at a constellation that once hung in a different sky, still encoding the memory of a vanished era, the last testament of a people who knew they were dying, and who built not for themselves, but for us. The Great Pyramid, an instrument of resonance. If the layout of Giza encodes a message in stars, then perhaps the Great Pyramid itself is more than architecture. Perhaps it is an instrument. To enter the Great Pyramid is to leave the world of light and wind, and step into something else entirely, a darkness that feels less like absence, and more like presence. The air is still, the temperature constant, and the silence, once your ears adjust, is not empty. It hums with a quality that feels almost mathematical, as if the stone itself is listening, waiting, resonating at frequencies just below human hearing. The passage leading inward is narrow, sloping downward at a 26-degree angle, walls smooth and precise, carved from limestone blocks that fit together with tolerances measured in millimeters. Then the corridor rises steeply now into the grand gallery, a towering corbelled shaft that ascends toward the heart of the structure. Its walls lean inward in stepped layers, each course of stone cantilevered slightly over the one below, creating a space that feels less like a hallway and more like the interior of a musical instrument, a resonance chamber, designed to amplify something we can no longer name. At the top of the gallery lies the king's chamber. This room, measuring roughly 34 feet long, 17 feet wide, and 19 feet high, is cut entirely from red granite, not the local limestone of the pyramid's mass, but stone quarried from Aswan 500 miles south, transported upriver, and then dragged across the plateau to be lifted into place hundreds of feet above the desert floor. Each block weighs between 25 and 80 tons. The ceiling alone consists of 9 massive granite slabs together weighing over 400 tons, engineered to distribute the immense weight of the pyramid above, without crushing the chamber beneath. But the choice of granite was not merely structural. Granite is piezoelectric. It contains crystalline quartz, a mineral that generates an electrical charge when subjected to mechanical stress or vibration. Squeeze quartz and it produces voltage. Vibrate it, and it oscillates at precise frequencies. The entire king's chamber is constructed from stone that, under the right conditions, can convert mechanical energy into electrical energy, and vice versa. The ancient Egyptians, as far as we know, had no concept of electricity. They left no records of electromagnetic theory, no diagrams of circuits or capacitors. And yet, whether by accident or by design, they built a chamber from a material that responds to vibration in ways that modern physics is only beginning to fully understand. In the 1990s, acoustic engineer Christopher Dunn conducted resonance tests inside the king's chamber. Using audio equipment and frequency generators, he discovered that the chamber has a natural resonant frequency, centered around 440 Hz, the same frequency as the musical note A, the tuning standard for modern orchestras, and a harmonic closely aligned with Earth's natural electromagnetic frequency, known as the Schumann resonance, approximately 7.83 Hz, with higher harmonics extending into the hundreds of Hz. When a sound at this frequency is introduced into the chamber, the granite walls amplify it. The space itself vibrates not violently, but in a low, sustained oscillation that seems to sink into the stone, into the bones of anyone standing inside. Dunn described the sensation as feeling the sound not with your ears, but with your entire body, as if the chamber were designed to turn acoustic waves into physical experience, to make vibration tangible. But sound is only one form of wave energy. In 2018, an international team of physicists from ITMA University in Russia and the Laserzentrum Hanover in Germany published a study that would have seemed absurd if it hadn't been rigorously peer-reviewed. The Great Pyramid, they found, can focus and concentrate electromagnetic energy within its internal chambers and beneath its base. Using mathematical models and simulations, the researchers analyzed how the pyramid's geometry interacts with electromagnetic waves in the radio frequency range. They discovered that when exposed to resonant wavelengths, the pyramid doesn't simply reflect or absorb the energy, it channels it. Electromagnetic fields become concentrated in the king's chamber, the queen's chamber, and in the underground space directly beneath the structure, creating pockets of intensified energy that theoretically could be measured and utilized. The study was careful to note that this does not mean the pyramid was a power plant. There is no evidence of ancient machinery, no copper wiring, no apparatus to harness or store the focused energy. But the data revealed something equally profound: the pyramid's shape, dimensions, and internal structure create these effects naturally, as an emergent property of its geometry. Whether intentional or coincidental, the Great Pyramid functions as a resonant cavity in architectural form that interacts with Earth's natural electromagnetic field in measurable, repeatable ways. And this raises an uncomfortable question: if the builders did not understand electricity, then why does their structure behave like an electromagnetic instrument? Perhaps the answer lies not in modern physics, but in ancient perception. Cultures across the ancient world spoke of sacred sites as places of power, locations where the boundary between material and spiritual became thin, where energy could be felt, where the body and mind responded to forces invisible but undeniable. Stonehenge, the Oracle of Delphi, Teotihuacan, Angkor Wat all were described as places where the earth hummed, where consciousness shifted, where reality felt more open. Modern science has begun to validate these experiences. Geomagnetism varies across the planet's surface. Certain locations show higher concentrations of natural electromagnetic radiation. Underground water flows, geological fault lines, and concentrations of quartz-bearing rock all generate measurable fields that can affect human physiology, altering brainwave patterns, inducing altered states, creating sensations of presence or transcendence. Perhaps the builders of Giza understood this not through equations, but through direct experience. Perhaps they could sense, as some sensitive individuals still can, the places where Earth's energy concentrated. And perhaps they built the pyramid not to generate power from machines, but to amplify the resonance already present, to create a space where human consciousness could align with the frequencies of the planet itself. The king's chamber contains no hieroglyphs, no inscriptions, no decorative art, only bare granite, geometric precision, and a stone sarcophagus that has never been proven to hold a body. If it was a tomb, it is the strangest tomb ever built, silent, empty, and resonant. But if it was a chamber of initiation, a space designed to alter consciousness through sound and vibration, then its features begin to make sense: the narrow passages that force you to crawl, shedding your upright human posture, the ascending gallery that prepares you step by step for what lies above, the sudden expansion into the chamber itself, where the resonance can envelop you completely, and the granite sarcophagus, sized not for burial, but for a living person to lie within, surrounded by stone that vibrates at the frequency of life itself. Some researchers have theorized that the pyramid was a temple of transformation, a structure where initiates underwent experiences designed to align their inner frequencies with the cosmic order, to dissolve the boundary between self and universe, to touch, however briefly, the underlying harmony of existence. Science cannot prove this. We have no written accounts, no diagrams, no testimony from those who may have lain in that chamber 12,000 years ago and felt the stones sing around them. But we have the structure itself. And the structure speaks through physics, through resonance, through the measurable ways it interacts with energy. The pyramid is not a simple pile of stone. It is a tuned system, an architectural arrangement that responds to vibration, focuses electromagnetic fields, and creates acoustic environments unlike anything else on Earth. Whether this was the result of advanced knowledge or intuitive genius, the outcome is the same: a monument that functions at the level of physics as both symbol and machine. Not a machine to power cities or generate electricity, but a machine to amplify connection between Earth and sky, matter and energy, human consciousness and the resonant frequency of the living planet. In the king's chamber, in the silence that is not silent, you are surrounded by granite that contains compressed quartz stone that remembers pressure, that converts force into charge, that hums with the slow, patient oscillation of crystalline structure under the weight of millions of tons above. Stand in that space long enough, and you may begin to feel it: a vibration just below hearing, a hum in the bones, a sense that the pyramid is not inert, but alive, not in the biological sense, but in the way a bell is alive when struck, the way a tuning fork holds its note long after the sound has faded from the air. The ancient Egyptians called the Great Pyramid Aket Khufu, the horizon of Khufu. But perhaps the name is deeper. Perhaps it refers not to a king, but to a threshold, a horizon between worlds, between frequencies, between the material and the ineffable. The pyramid does not need to be a power plant to be profound. It only needs to resonate. And in doing so, it reminds us that stone is not dead, that geometry is not abstract, and that the monuments we inherit from the deep past may encode knowledge we are only now beginning to hear. The global pattern, other ancient megalithic sites. If Giza stands alone in its precision and mystery, then perhaps we are looking at the wrong map. Perhaps Egypt is not the exception, but part of a pattern, a global signature of knowledge that transcends borders, oceans, and the very concept of isolated civilizations emerging independently from darkness. Because Giza is not alone. Across the planet, scattered like fragments of a shattered mirror, lie monuments that should not exist, structures carved with impossible precision, aligned to celestial events with mathematical sophistication, built from stones so massive that moving them defies explanation even with modern technology. And the deeper we look, the clearer the pattern becomes. These sites are not random. They share architectural DNA, geometry, astronomy, and a reverence for stone. That speaks not of coincidence, but of connection. The question is no longer whether advanced knowledge existed before recorded history. The question is how far did it spread? Göbekli Tepe, Turkey. In the hills of southeastern Turkey, near the modern town of Anl1 Urfa, lies a site that has rewritten everything we thought we knew about human civilization. Göbekli Tepe Podbeli Hill in Turkish is a complex of massive stone circles and megalithic enclosures that date to approximately 9500 BC. To understand how impossible this is, consider what archaeology teaches. 9500 BC is the pre-Pottery Neolithic, an era before farming, before cities, before writing, before anything we associate with civilization. Humans at that time were supposed to be nomadic hunter-gatherers, living in small bands, surviving on wild plants and game. They were not supposed to be capable of monumental architecture. Yet Göbekli Tepe exists. The site consists of at least 20 circular enclosures, each defined by massive shaped pillars carved from limestone bedrock. Some pillars stand over 18 feet tall and weigh up to 20 tons. They are adorned with intricate bas-reliefs, foxes, lions, scorpions, vultures, serpents carved with such skill that they rival the artistry of any later civilization. The pillars are arranged in precise geometric patterns, and the enclosures are aligned to astronomical events: the summer solstice, the winter solstice, key stars on the horizon. This was not a village. There are no signs of permanent habitation, no evidence of domestic structures or food storage. Göbekli Tepe was a ceremonial center, a place where people gathered for purposes we can only guess: ritual, astronomy, the transmission of knowledge. And it was built by people who, according to the standard narrative, should not have had the organizational capacity, the engineering knowledge, or the motivation to create something so complex. But they did. And then around 8000 BC, they buried it deliberately. The entire site was filled in with rubble and soil, preserving it for thousands of years until its rediscovery in the 1990s. Why would a culture invest such monumental effort to build these structures only to bury them and walk away? Perhaps because the world was changing. Perhaps because the knowledge needed to be hidden, encoded in stone, waiting for a future that could decode it. Baalbek, Lebanon. 1500 miles west, in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, the ancient city of Baalbek rises from the landscape like a monument to impossibility. The Romans built a magnificent temple complex here, dedicating it to Jupiter. Their columns still tower above the valley, testaments to imperial ambition. But beneath the Roman construction lies something older, something the Romans themselves did not build but built upon. The foundation of the Temple of Jupiter rests on a platform of megalithic stones known as the Trilithon, 3 limestone blocks, each weighing approximately 800 tons. To put this in perspective, the largest stones in the Great Pyramid weigh about 80 tons. The Trilithon blocks are 10 times heavier. These stones are not roughly cut. They are shaped with precision, their surfaces smooth, their edges sharp. They fit together so tightly that mortar was unnecessary. And they were somehow transported from a quarry a quarter-mile away, lifted into position, and set into a terrace wall at a height of 20 feet above ground level. Modern cranes struggle to lift 800 tons. Ancient Rome, with all its engineering prowess, never moved stones of this size. Yet here they are, incorporated into the Roman temple's foundation, so massive that the Romans simply built around them, acknowledging an older construction they could not replicate. Local legend attributes the platform to a pre-flood civilization, calling it the work of giants or gods. Roman historians wrote that Baalbek was ancient even in their time, that the foundations were laid at the beginning of the world. And radiocarbon dating of material beneath the stones suggests construction phases extending back thousands of years before Roman occupation. Whoever built the Trilithon possessed knowledge of engineering, leverage, and stone manipulation that we have not recovered. And they chose to build not for utility, but for permanence, as if they knew their work would outlast empires. Yonaguni Monument, Japan. Off the southern coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, divers in 1987 discovered something that should not be underwater: massive stone structures carved into terraces, platforms, and angular formations that resemble pyramids. The Yonaguni Monument lies 80 feet below the surface, covered in coralline sediment. Its features include flat platforms, rectangle corners, carved steps, and what appear to be ceremonial pathways, all cut from a single bedrock formation. Geologists debate whether it is entirely natural, entirely artificial, or a natural formation enhanced and shaped by human hands. But the most compelling evidence is geological, not architectural. The structures lie submerged because sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. If they were carved by humans, they must have been accessible, which means they date to at least 10,000 BC, when the coastline was lower and the monuments stood above water. Japan's archaeological establishment resists this conclusion. There is no evidence, they argue, that the region's hunter-gatherer populations possessed the technology or social organization to carve megalithic structures. Yet the stones remain angular and deliberate, submerged beneath centuries of sediment and rising tides. Like Giza, like Göbekli Tepe, like Baalbek aligned, precise, and impossibly old. Sacsayhuman in Peru. Half a world away, on the outskirts of Cusco, Peru, the ruins of Sacsayhuman cling to a hillside overlooking the ancient Inca capital. The Spanish conquistadors who first encountered the site believed it was a fortress. The Inca themselves claimed they did not build it, that it was constructed by an earlier race, the people who came before. The stonework defies comprehension. Massive andesite blocks, some weighing over 200 tons, are fitted together with such precision that a knife blade cannot slide between them. There is no mortar. No metal tools were used, at least none that archaeology has identified. And yet the surfaces are smooth, the angles perfect, the interlocking shape so complex that each stone is a unique polygon, custom cut to fit its neighbors with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. More astonishing is the site's seismic resistance. Peru is earthquake-prone. Yet Sacsayhuman has stood for centuries, possibly millennia, without collapsing. The stones are designed to shift slightly during seismic activity, then settle back into place. Modern engineers call this principle anti-seismic architecture, a technique rediscovered in the 20th century. Yet it was implemented at Sacsayhuman long before recorded Andean history. The Inca attributed the construction to Viracocha, the creator god who emerged after a great flood to rebuild the world, not a king, not a dynasty, but a survivor, a teacher, a figure who brought knowledge from a time before. The global pattern. 4 continents. 4 impossible sites. Separated by oceans, mountains, and thousands of miles. Yet unified by principles that should not exist. They all use megalithic construction, moving stones far beyond the capabilities of the cultures we credit with building them. They all exhibit astronomical alignment, tracking solstices, equinoxes, and stellar events with precision. They all incorporate sacred geometry, ratios and angles that appear again and again, the golden ratio, pi, alignments to true north. They all are, in one way or another, older than the civilizations that claimed them. The conventional explanation is independent invention, that humans across the globe, isolated from one another, spontaneously developed similar architectural traditions. But the similarities are too specific, too precise, too mathematically consistent to be coincidence. There is another explanation. What if, in the closing centuries of the Ice Age, as the climate collapsed and the younger dryas tore through ecosystems worldwide, the survivors of an earlier culture scattered, fleeing rising seas, advancing ice, and collapsing food systems? What if they carried with them fragments of knowledge, astronomy, geometry, stone masonry, and used that knowledge to rebuild in the places where they landed? They would not have arrived with blueprints or texts. They would have arrived with memory, oral traditions, celestial alignments, techniques passed down through survival. And in every region where they settled, they would have built monuments to preserve what they knew, encoding their understanding of the cosmos in the only language that transcends time: stone. Giza, Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, Yonaguni, Sacsayhuman, these are not isolated achievements. They are echoes, fragments of a knowledge system that once spanned the globe, fractured by catastrophe, preserved by those who refused to let it die. The builders did not conquer the world. They survived it. And in their monuments carved in bedrock, aligned to stars, resonant with the frequencies of the earth itself, they left proof that humanity has risen before, and that we carry, buried in stone and myth, the memory of what we once knew. The pattern is global. The knowledge is encoded. And the message is clear: we have been here before. The catastrophe, evidence of cosmic impact. If the monuments we've examined are survivors of a lost world, then we must ask the question that archaeology avoids: what killed that world? Not slowly through cultural evolution or gradual decline, but catastrophically in a span of time so brief that entire ecosystems collapsed, coastlines drowned, and the climate of the planet shifted within a single human generation. The evidence has been hiding in plain sight, buried in sediment layers across every continent, waiting for scientists to recognize it for what it is: the signature of cosmic impact. The story begins in 2007, when a team of researchers led by Richard Firestone, a nuclear scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, published findings that would challenge the foundations of climate science. They had been studying a thin layer of sediment found at archaeological sites across North America, a dark band of soil, marking a boundary between 2 years. Embedded precisely at the 12,900-year mark in the geological record, this layer, no thicker than a human hand, contained materials that should not exist naturally on Earth's surface. Nanodiamonds, microscopic crystals that form only under extreme pressure and heat, the kind generated by cosmic impacts or nuclear explosions. Magnetic spherules, tiny beads of iron and other metals, melted at temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees centigrade, then rapidly cooled into perfect spheres. Iridium, a rare element uncommon in Earth's crust but abundant in asteroids and comets. Carbon spherules, evidence of biomass burned to such intensity that organic matter turned into glass. Malt glass, silicon-rich material found in deserts and impact craters, formed when sand is superheated beyond its melting point and fuses into glassy fragments. This material appears in sediment layers from Pennsylvania to Arizona, from Greenland to Syria, all dating to the same narrow window of time. The implications were inescapable. 12,900 years ago, something struck Earth with enough force to scatter debris across an entire hemisphere. Not a single asteroid, but a fragmented comet, a swarm of icy projectiles, perhaps dozens of kilometers across before breaking apart, that slammed into the northern hemisphere's ice sheets, oceans, and land masses, in a cascade of impacts lasting hours or days. The explosions would have vaporized ice, ignited forests, and sent shock waves rippling through the atmosphere. Impact plumes would have lofted billions of tons of dust, soot, and vaporized rock into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight and triggering a rapid climate shift that geologists now call the Younger Dryas. Temperatures, which had been rising steadily as the Ice Age retreated, plummeted. In some regions, average temperatures dropped by 15 degrees centigrade within a decade. The North Atlantic Ocean circulation, the current that moderates climate across Europe and North America, stalled, plunging the northern latitudes back into glacial conditions. Ice sheets that had been retreating surged southward again. Rain belts collapsed, and ecosystems that had flourished for thousands of years died en masse. The megafauna of the Pleistocene, mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, went extinct. Not gradually, but suddenly. Their remains are found in mass graves, preserved in frozen muck, sometimes still standing as if death had come too quickly for them to fall. In North America alone, over 35 genera of large mammals vanished within a few centuries. And humans nearly followed. Population genetic studies suggest a bottleneck event around this time, a dramatic reduction in human numbers, consistent with a near extinction event. The archaeological record shows abandonment of sites, cessation of tool traditions, and a gap in continuity that spans generations. In some regions, it would take 1,000 years for human populations to recover. But this was not just a North American catastrophe. The evidence is global. In Europe, sediment cores from lakes and peat bogs show the same abrupt climate shift, the same markers of fire and impact. In the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, birthplace of agriculture, shows sudden environmental collapse. In South America, megafauna extinctions mirrored the northern pattern. In Australia, Aboriginal oral traditions speak of a time when the sky fell and the world was consumed by fire and flood. Because the impacts didn't just cause freezing, they caused firestorms. When comet fragments struck ice sheets, the energy released would have been equivalent to millions of nuclear warheads, vaporizing ice into superheated steam, igniting the atmosphere itself in localized regions. Forests across entire continents would have burned. The smoke alone, combined with impact dust, would have darkened the sky for months, perhaps years, creating a nuclear winter effect without nuclear weapons. And then came the floods. Melting ice sheets, destabilized by the impacts, sent torrents of fresh water into the oceans, raising sea levels and disrupting ocean currents. Coastal settlements, if any existed, would have been drowned. River valleys would have flooded. Lakes would have overflowed their banks. The geological term is meltwater pulse, a catastrophic, rapid rise in sea level, as ice dams broke and glaciers collapsed into the sea. This is not speculation. This is recorded in coral reefs, in sediment cores, in the drowned river valleys and submerged coastlines that exist on every continent. The world as it existed before 12,900 years ago, the green Sahara, the fertile coastlines, the temperate forests of North America vanished beneath ice, fire, and rising water. Humanity remembered. And humanity remembered. Myths from every inhabited continent speak of the same event, described in the language of gods and punishment, but encoding the same core memory. The sky caught fire, the earth shook, the waters rose, and the world nearly ended. In Egyptian mythology, the goddess Sekhmet, the Eye of Ra, was sent to destroy rebellious humanity. She descended as a lion made of fire, consuming the earth until the gods, fearing total annihilation, tricked her into drinking beer dyed red to look like blood. She stopped, and humanity survived barely. The story encodes fire from above, mass destruction, and divine intervention that halts total extinction. In Mesopotamian texts, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes the flood of Utnapishtim. For 6 days and 6 nights, the winds blew, torrent and tempest and flood overwhelmed the world. Not just rain, but cosmic fury, fire and water together, the very elements in chaos. The Hopi of North America speak of the world of fire, the second world destroyed when the sky fell and the poles shifted, forcing survivors to flee underground until the burning stopped. Their oral traditions describe not one catastrophe but cycles of destruction, with the current world being the fourth, a memory of recurring extinction that aligns eerily with Earth's geological record of periodic impacts. In Hindu cosmology, the Kali Yuga, the Age of Darkness, begins with fire and flood, the dissolution of the previous world order, and the survival of only a remnant to carry knowledge into the new age. The Norse Ragnarok tells of Surtur's fire consuming the earth, the seas boiling, the sky splitting, and a handful of gods and humans surviving to rebuild. Even Australia's Aboriginal Dreamtime speaks of a time when the sky people threw fire, and the land was reshaped. Stories that anthropologists once dismissed as pure mythology, until geological surveys revealed impact craters and null glass deposits in the Australian interior, some dating to within the range of human habitation. These are not fairy tales. They are cultural memory, oral histories transmitted across hundreds of generations, preserving in mythic language what geology has only recently confirmed. Earth was struck, humanity nearly perished, and those who survived carried the trauma as sacred narrative. In the aftermath, the world was unrecognizable. Coastlines had shifted. Forests had burned. Ice-covered lands that had been tempered. And the survivors, scattered, traumatized, reduced to a fraction of their former numbers, faced a choice: forget or remember. Some forgot. They retreated into survival, into hunting and gathering, into small bands that rebuilt from nothing, their connection to the past severed by the violence of the transition. But others remembered. They migrated to the places where life could still persist: the Nile Valley, fed by equatorial rains; the highlands of Turkey, where altitude provided refuge; the coasts of Japan, before they sank; the fertile valleys of Lebanon and Peru. And in those places, they built not palaces, not fortresses, but monuments. Structures designed to outlast climate, to survive the next catastrophe, to encode in geometry and astronomy the knowledge they could not bear to lose again. They built in stone because stone endures. They aligned to stars because stars are eternal. And they carved images, symbols, and mathematical relationships into bedrock, so that even if language died, even if writing was lost, the architecture itself would speak. These Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, these are not monuments of conquest. They are monuments of remembrance, raised by people who had witnessed the end of the world and refused to let it be forgotten. The sky had fallen once. It could fall again. And so they built their warning, their testimony, their defiance, not in words that fade, but in limestone, granite, and celestial alignment. A message carved for a future they would never see, by hands that had touched the ashes of a world consumed by fire. The day the sky fell, humanity nearly died. But we did not. And the monuments remained silent witnesses to the night of flames, the rising waters, and the long cold dark that followed, proof that we have survived the unsurvivable before, and encoded that survival in the only language that transcends extinction: stone. Zap-Tepi, the Egyptian memory of a lost age. If the survivors of the Younger Dryas carried memory forward through stone, they also carried it through story. And in Egypt, those stories were not called myths. They were called history, sacred history, yes, but history nonetheless. The Egyptians themselves believed their civilization was not a beginning, but a restoration, an echo of an earlier age when gods walked the earth, and order was established for the first time. They called that age Zap-Tepi, the first time. It appears throughout Egyptian religious texts, carved into temple walls, written on papyrus, recited in ritual. Zap-Tepi was the moment when chaos became cosmos, when the primordial waters receded, when the first land emerged, and when divine order was established. It was the template, the golden age, the blueprint against which all later history would be measured. And every pharaoh for 3,000 years claimed not to be creating something new, but restoring what had been lost, bringing Egypt back into alignment with Zap-Tepi, the perfection of the first time. But what if Zap-Tepi was not myth? What if it was memory? The oldest surviving account of creation in Egyptian cosmology comes from Heliopolis, the city of the sun, whose theological texts describe the beginning of the world in strikingly geological terms. In the beginning, there was only none, the primordial ocean, dark, infinite, and formless. Nothing existed but water, stretching in all directions, lifeless and still. Then from the depths of none rose the Benben, the first mound, the primeval hill, the original piece of solid ground to emerge from the flood. Upon this mound stood Atum, the self-created god who spoke the world into existence. From Atum came Shu, air, and Tefnut, moisture, then Jeb, earth, and Nut, sky, and from them the gods of life and death, order and chaos, light and darkness. But the foundation of it all was the Benben, the first solid thing, the island of stability in an ocean of chaos. This is not abstract philosophy. This is a description of geological process of land emerging as floodwaters recede, of stable ground, appearing where only water had been, of the moment when survival becomes possible again. And the Egyptians commemorated it in stone. At Heliopolis, the most sacred object was the Benben stone, a conical or pyramidal rock, possibly meteoric in origin, that symbolized that first mound. It was kept in the temple of Ra, treated not as a symbol, but as a relic, a physical remnant of the first time. Pharaohs would journey to Heliopolis to touch it, to connect themselves to the moment of creation, to claim legitimacy through continuity with the gods who had walked the earth when the waters withdrew. The stone itself is lost, destroyed, or buried in the millennia since Heliopolis fell to ruin. But its shape endures, because every pyramid in Egypt is crowned with a pyramidion, a capstone shaped like the Benben, covered in gold or electrum, to catch the first rays of the rising sun. The pyramid, in this light, is not a tomb, but a monument to emergence, a scaled representation of the first mound rising from the flood. The Great Pyramid's missing capstone, if it ever existed, would have been the ultimate bend in the apex of the axis mundi, the point where Earth meets sky, where human order touches divine chaos and holds it at bay. The parallels to post-catastrophe reality are unavoidable. 12,000 years ago, as the Younger Dryas ended and the climate slowly stabilized, sea levels were rising. Glaciers melted, coastlines shifted, rivers swelled beyond their banks. For communities living through this transition, the dominant experience would have been water not as life-giving rain, but as overwhelming flood, drowning the lowlands, submerging valleys, forcing migration to higher ground. And then, gradually, the waters receded. New coastlines stabilized. Floodplains dried. And in the fertile refuges the Nile Valley, foremost among them the first stable ground, appeared islands of soil where crops could grow, where settlements could take root, where civilization could be rebuilt. To the survivors, this would have felt like creation, not metaphorical creation, but literal. A world reborn from the waters. A second chance after near extinction. And they encoded that experience in myth. Nun as the flood, the Benben as the first dry land, Atum as the spirit of survival and renewal. The Egyptians did not invent this story. They inherited it, passed down through generations as oral history, ritualized and sanctified until it became the foundation of their entire cosmology. Zap-Tepi was not mythology. It was cultural memory of the age when their ancestors survived the deluge and began again. This interpretation transforms how we read Egyptian religion. Every major ritual in ancient Egypt was a reenactment of Zap-Tepi. The coronation of a new pharaoh symbolized the restoration of Ma'at, the return to divine order after a period of chaos. The said festival, celebrated after 30 years of a king's reign, renewed his connection to the first time, ensuring the cosmos remained aligned. Even the daily temple rituals, lighting incense, offering food, opening the doors of the sanctuary at dawn, were described as performing what happened in the first time, as if every sunrise were a reminder that the world had been saved once and must be maintained through vigilance. The pharaohs themselves were explicit about this. Inscriptions at Karnak, Luxor, and Abydos described kings not as conquerors, but as restorers. Thutmose III claims to have restored what was ruined. Ramesses II declares he renewed the monuments of the ancestors. Seti I describes himself as one who brings Egypt back to what it was in the time of Ra. They did not see themselves as innovators. They saw themselves as custodians, maintaining a continuity with an earlier, pure age, an age when the gods themselves had walked the Nile, when knowledge was complete, when the alignment between heaven and earth was perfect. And the most explicit evidence of this belief is found in an artifact already mentioned, the inventory stela, discovered at Giza in the 19th century. The inventory stela is a limestone tablet inscribed during Egypt's later periods, possibly the 26th dynasty, though it claims to record events from the reign of Khufu, the pharaoh traditionally credited with building the Great Pyramid, around 2500 BC. But the stela does not say Khufu built the Great Pyramid. It says he found it. The text describes how Khufu discovered the house of Isis, mistress of the pyramid, already standing beside the house of the Sphinx, both monuments existing before his time. It claims he restored them, cleared sand from around them, and built new temples nearby to honor the gods who protected these ancient structures. Mainstream Egyptology dismisses the stela as a pious fiction, a later attempt to attribute greater antiquity to the site. But even if the stela is not a direct record of Khufu's reign, the fact that later Egyptians believed the monuments were older than the 4th dynasty is significant. It suggests a tradition, a persistent cultural memory that Giza's monuments predated dynastic Egypt, that they were inheritances from Zap-Tepi, from the first time, from the age before. If we read Egyptian mythology as encoded geology, the entire cosmology clicks into focus. None is not abstract chaos. It is the memory of the rising seas, the meltwater floods, the drowned coastlines of the early Holocene. The Benben is not a metaphysical concept. It is the first stable ground to emerge as the waters withdrew, the Giza Plateau perhaps, or the highlands of Upper Egypt, places where survivors gathered and began to rebuild. Atum is not a deity in the modern sense. He is the archetype of survival, the self-generated one, the one who creates himself from nothing, who rises from the water, and speaks order into chaos. He is the collective memory of those who endured the catastrophe and re-established civilization. Not the principle of cosmic order, truth, and balance is not theological abstraction. It is the hard-won knowledge that survival depends on harmony with the climate, with the Nile's cycles, with the movements of the stars. Ma'at is what the ancestors learned in the crucible of extinction, and what they encoded in ritual to ensure it would never be forgotten. And the pyramids, especially the Great Pyramid, are Benbens writ large. They are monuments to emergence, to the first solid ground, to the moment when humanity climbed out of the flood and rebuilt. Their alignment to the stars preserves the memory of the sky as it was in Zap-Tepi the first time, the age when order was reborn. The Egyptians did not worship the past because they were primitive. They worshipped it because they remembered. They remembered that civilization had collapsed before. They remembered that the world had drowned, that the sky had darkened, that their ancestors had nearly perished. And they built their entire culture around ensuring it would not happen again through ritual, through architecture, through the obsessive preservation of Ma'at, the order that keeps chaos at bay. Zatipi was not the first creation. It was the first restoration. And every pharaoh, every temple, every pyramid was an act of memory, refusal to forget, a defiant insistence that the world could be saved because it had been saved before. The gods did not descend from heaven. They emerged from the flood. And the temples, the myths, the towering monuments of stone, they are not fantasies. They are records, written in the only languages that survive extinction: architecture, ritual, and story. The waters rose. The land emerged. And on that first mound, humanity began again. This is not myth. This is what happened. Conclusion: a message carved in stone and stars. When the sun sets at Giza, the monuments transform. The limestone, which burns white and gold under the afternoon heat, softens into shades of amber and violet. Shadows lengthen across the plateau. The wind dies, and as the last light fades from the western sky, the stars emerge, first a handful, then hundreds, then thousands, until the entire dome of heaven is ablaze with light that left its source thousands of years ago, and has traveled across the void to arrive here now, above 3 pyramids that have been waiting. At night, Giza stops being a ruin. It becomes a map. Look south. There, low on the horizon, rises Orion, the hunter, the eternal wonder, the constellation the Egyptians called Sa, the soul of Osiris. 3 stars in perfect diagonal alignment: Alnitak, Alnilam, Mintaka, Orion's belt, the most recognizable pattern in the night sky. And below them, on the earth, 3 pyramids in the same configuration, the same angle, the same relative brightness. The Great Pyramid corresponds to Alnitak, Khafar's pyramid to Alnilam, Menkaur's smaller pyramid to Mintaka, offset to the east just as the star is offset in the sky. Turn west. The Nile flows north through the darkness, a ribbon of reflected starlight cutting through the desert. And above it, arcing across the heavens, flows the Milky Way, the celestial river, the road of souls, the luminous band of 100 billion stars that the Egyptians saw as the heavenly counterparts of the earthly Nile. River below, river above. Life on earth mirroring life in the cosmos. The alignment is not approximate. It is not symbolic. It is precise, encoded in millions of tons of limestone, designed to be read by anyone with eyes to see and knowledge to interpret. This is not architecture. This is language. For 9 chapters, we have assembled the evidence like archaeologists piecing together a shattered artifact. The geology that proves the Sphinx witnessed rainfall Egypt no longer receives. The astronomy that dates Giza's layout to a sky that existed 12,500 years ago. The resonance properties that reveal the Great Pyramid as an instrument tuned to the frequency of the Earth itself. The global pattern of megaliths that suggests a scattered diaspora carrying fragments of a unified knowledge system. The catastrophe that nearly ended human civilization. The myths that encoded that catastrophe as sacred history, preserved through thousands of years of ritual and retelling. Each piece alone could be dismissed coincidence, misinterpretation, confirmation bias. But together they form a picture too coherent to ignore. Giza is not what we were told. It is not a cemetery for kings who died 4,500 years ago. It is not a vanity project of rulers obsessed with immortality. It is something older, something stranger, something that challenges the entire narrative of human history we have constructed to comfort ourselves with the illusion of steady progress. Giza is a survivor, a monument raised by people who had witnessed the end of the world and refused to let it be forgotten. A message encoded in geometry, astronomy, and sacred proportion, universal languages that transcend culture, that require no translation, that speak directly through mathematics to any civilization advanced enough to decode them. And the message is this: we were here. We understood. We survived. And so can you. Consider what it means to build for eternity, not for a dynasty, not for a generation, but for deep time, for a future so distant that language will have changed beyond recognition, that nations will have risen and fallen, that the very shape of the coastline may have shifted. How do you communicate across that abyss? You cannot use words. Language dies. Akkadian, Sumerian, linear, entire scripts lost, their meanings locked in clay tablets no one can read. Even Egyptian hieroglyphs were forgotten for over 1,000 years, their secrets unrecoverable until the Rosetta Stone provided a key. Words are fragile. They fade. But geometry is eternal. The ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter is pi today, 12,000 years ago, and 12,000 years from now. A right triangle always obeys the Pythagorean theorem. The golden ratio appears in spirals, in pine cones, in galaxies. It is woven into the structure of reality itself. And if you encode these ratios into architecture, into dimensions and proportions and angles, then anyone who measures, anyone who calculates, anyone who thinks in numbers will eventually understand. The Great Pyramid encodes pi in the ratio of its height to its base perimeter. It encodes phi, the golden ratio, in its slope and internal passages. Its dimensions correspond to the proportions of the Earth itself, scaled models of the planet's radius and circumference. These are not accidents. These are intentional signatures, fingerprints left in stone by builders who understood that mathematics is the one language that survives the collapse of civilizations. And astronomy is eternal. The stars move, yes, but they move in predictable cycles. Precession takes 26,000 years to complete, but it is regular, measurable, and reversible through calculation. If you encode a specific stellar alignment into architecture, any future civilization with knowledge of precession can work backward, reconstructing the sky as it appeared when the monument was built. Giza's alignment to Orion in 10,500 BC is a timestamp, a cosmic signature that says, this is when we built. This is what we knew. This is the sky we saw when the world was reborn. The builders did not need to write a single word. The architecture itself speaks. But the message is not merely informational. It is existential. Standing at Giza at night, under stars that have watched empires rise and crumble, you feel the weight of time not as an abstraction, but as a presence. These stones have been here longer than Islam, longer than Christianity, longer than Rome, longer than the invention of the wheel. They have outlasted every power that has tried to claim them, every theory that has tried to explain them, every attempt to reduce them to simple tombs or monuments to human ego. They endure because they were built to endure, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. The people who raised them knew something we have forgotten, that civilizations are not immortal, that climate can collapse, that knowledge can be lost, that humanity, despite all its cleverness, exists on the razor edge of survival, always one catastrophe away from extinction. And so they built not for themselves, but for us, for whoever would come after, whoever would survive the next flood or fiber impact, whoever would stand on this plateau thousands of years later and ask, who were you, and what did you know? The answer is carved into the bedrock: we were survivors. We knew the stars, the geometry of space, the resonance of matter and energy. We understood that the universe is not chaos, but order, and that order can be encoded, preserved, transmitted across the ages in stone and starlight. We built these monuments not to honor death, but to defy it. In the pre-dawn darkness, the air at Giza is cold and still. The desert holds its breath. And then, on the eastern horizon, the first pale light begins to gather, not yet sunrise, but the promise of it, the anticipation of another day beginning, as it has for millions of mornings, since the pyramids first rose from the plateau. The Sphinx faces that light. Has faced it for thousands of years. Will face it for thousands more, if we allow it. The pyramids stand aligned to cardinal perfection, tracking the sun's path across the sky with the precision of sundials. And above, growing fainter as the sky brightens, Orion sets in the west, completing its nightly journey, disappearing below the horizon until the next twilight calls it back. This is the rhythm the builders encoded: the cycle, day and night, winter and summer, birth and death and rebirth, the eternal return of light after darkness, order after chaos, life after the flood that nearly drowned the world. They understood what we have forgotten: that time is not linear but circular, that history does not march toward inevitable progress, but moves in waves, rising, cresting, collapsing, and rising again. And in that understanding, they found not despair but hope. Because if civilization has fallen before and been rebuilt, then it can be rebuilt again, and again, and again. The pyramids are not monuments to kings. They are monuments to continuity. They are proof that knowledge can survive catastrophe, that memory can outlast oblivion, that the human impulse to understand, to build, to reach toward the stars, is stronger than any force that tries to extinguish it. As the sun breaks the horizon and light floods across the plateau, the pyramids seem almost transparent, edges softened, surfaces glowing as if they exist not quite in this world, but somewhere between matter and meaning, between stone and symbol. And perhaps that is what they have always been: not tombs, not power plants, not even strictly speaking architecture, but memory crystallized, encoded, indestructible, the distillation of human consciousness into its most permanent form, its most universal language, its most defiant assertion against the void. The world ended once. The ice came. The fire fell. The waters rose. Humanity survived by a thread, scattered to the edges of the habitable world, carrying fragments of knowledge that would take thousands of years to reassemble. And in the places where they landed, they built. They built in stone because stone endures. They built in alignment with the stars because stars are eternal. They built in sacred proportions because mathematics is truth. And they built not for themselves, but for the future, for us, for whoever would come after, for the distant children of a broken world who would one day stand here and wonder. The answer is beneath your feet and above your head, in the geometry of the pyramids and the light of Orion, in the resonance of granite and the memory encoded in myth. The builders of Giza were not honoring death. They were defying it, turning memory into architecture, survival into symbol, and time itself into stone. And as long as these monuments stand, as long as the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, the message remains.